Hello, so today I'm going to be talking about the last two chapters of Indian politics and political processes. I'm going to combine chapter 21 and 22 mainly because these chapters were already quite short compared to the other ones, and the content, it does speak more about the history, and there's not too much that at least I am too familiar with analyzing. But the two chapters, the 21st is about environmental issues that India has been facing and how the state is contributing to both environmental degradation and also to resolving this degradation. Chapter 22 is about the public healthcare system in India, specifically just public health in general in India, and the challenges that it's facing in the current day compared to then. So with chapter 21, I am not too familiar with environmental policy, and I won't act like I know it too well, but there are two aspects that I do have a pretty good insight on that I do want to shed light on. The first is hindsight bias, and especially hindsight bias towards national development. So I want us to keep in mind hindsight bias, especially when discussing India in its early developmental years, when national development was the priority. And the issue of environmental degradation wasn't a largely accepted global issue that most countries were thinking about at the time. So this bias by doing this, having this bias in mind, this prevents us from judging India as a country whose aim was to put itself before the environment, as this is an approach that became more prominent in the later years as we started to acknowledge the consequences of environmental damage. So when we eliminate that bias, let's approach this question a little more neutrally. Can we understand why those efforts were needed for the nation, and more specifically for the national development? The nation-state model that the British enacted on India didn't die once India achieved its independence, and it participated in the global stage of politics. And all this really did when India became independent was that now the British state building powers were reallocated into the Indian hands, and now the Indian people were in charge of building the state and participating in the global stage. Therefore, the model they followed was that they had become accustomed to what the British state already imposed on them. And already by the 20th century, this approach of state building was probably the only way, and in some ways, maybe even still today, that India could still build its state apparatus and autonomy through these connective efforts of bringing people together through roads that will happen on deforested lands, or curbing dehydration for mass populations that can be from constructing dams, which prevents natural water flow. Thus, these are the viable methods of state building that nearly every state has done and kind of continues to follow for developing countries like India in the 20th century, definitely. And also, this is how most countries can really rise to the top of global prominence by enacting national development efforts. So we might consider this as a simple hubris, that India just wanted to put itself before others, but these efforts were also to uplift the Indian people as a national community also. Practically every state's goal is to unite the country and assert its legitimacy as the protector of their people, and India is no different. Regardless of whether all the people in India's independent borders, which of course there were many who did not even want to be in India from its own independence, state infrastructure was and is still needed to uplift the people from faraway regions in order to establish their national unity. So let's keep in mind that it wasn't entirely a choice between national self-interest versus the environment, at least at the time when these national development projects were put into effect. But it was more of reaching the goal of national unity that came with the unintentional cost of environmental degradation. The nation-state's goal, whether you like it or not, is usually to bring the people together under the protection of said states, which is also a cause people continue to still fight for in nearly every democratic nation-state. And in some ways, the developmental process can be seen as a success in bringing together the Indian people for national growth even though it came at the cost of environmental degradation, and the word success is a bit of a fluid term. However, it's the whole concept of bringing the country together, building roads, building infrastructure that makes the country more apart together as one unity, and as one unit. So I end my argument on hindsight bias and the national development priority here only because I can't speak much on the environmental insight that can oppose my opinions. But I hope I at least brought some useful political insight into this concept. So the second aspect I also want to shed light from this topic is degrowth and how it wasn't exactly discussed, but it was an implied approach here that India is facing, at least in its own unique political arena. So degrowth is an interesting concept in this case because in the Indian context, with figures like Gandhi in this field providing India a unique challenge to approach degrowth as a tool of environmental restoration. So Gandhi's spiritual approach in regards to simple living is a concept worth exploring as a way of reducing the need for developmental projects that end up giving us more personal and external needs. Since India has progressed so much, and much of the country, and much of the urban culture especially, is centered on these developmental efforts, it'll be a difficult process to introduce degrowth or the reduction of these developmental efforts at least, and reorient Indian society on simple living, mainly because, in a way, simple living is less of these developmental efforts that was what India had before and was trying to escape. Essentially, by trying to fulfill this goal of reducing wants and living more as simply, the cities of Delhi and Mumbai would probably have to decline in some way, because these cities can thank development for its current growth, and something like the dense city living would likely become unappealing to Indians who would then live simple lives, likely in more sparse areas where the amenities of urban life might not match with the degrowth model. Similarly to what we read in the chapter about the growing middle class, this group's concern has seen rapid growth in recent generations, that the idea of repressing growth is perhaps seen as a reversion or a regression in some ways to the once debilitated state in the post-independent years, and it doesn't seem to have any popularity, at least among the two large political parties for. However, Gandhi's approach does touch on something unique in politics, at least unique in this time, which is the connection to how good politics can come from good spiritual being. That's an interesting concept that we don't discuss much, but Gandhi shed a bit light on this. And the authors didn't go too much into it, but I kind of found this more of my own analytical interest from this topic. But his belief in reducing the wants of the external world can in some way be seen as a reactionary approach, I feel, to the development, depending on how this approach is taken up, both a reactionary or revolutionary, it really depends, but a very radical, in some way, far-reaching movement. So regardless, there is a theme that we can connect to the spiritual moral authority of Christianity and the church that they took up in the pre-industrial revolution era in the West, especially in Europe. And this is where spiritual development was seen as the goal more, and not so much the national external world development that eventually came with the Industrial Revolution. So when we evaluate the fact that, that facet of the degrowth argument, perhaps they might have some validity for a country like India. There's already such a deep religious identity in parts of the rural country, and additionally, the high levels of population density in India and neighboring South Asian countries might benefit from the rejection of the wants that are a product of developmental efforts. But like in the US, degrowth has been a fringe idea from progressive Americans mainly, who choose this model as a rejection of capitalist consumption and environmental degradation, which is an interesting horseshoe moment that can be appealing to both the anti-environmental degradation as those voices, as well as the spiritual classical living forms, people who choose that form of living voices. And in India, this could possibly have the potential to be a strong movement. Maybe not now, but it has roots, and it has potential at least. And for both, this is something that is probably appealing to the rural Indian people, or just the people who simply favor this model and want to return to a rural living. However, this goes to the heart of the term progress. I think we should look into, is it progressive? Let's ask this. Is it progressive to become less invested in our wants like cars and indoor plumbing, when in fact this was the progress for those of just a century ago, especially for Indians of just a century ago? And to what extent will the Indian people genuinely want this return to little to live with when they already have a taste of receiving more than they could have imagined? So this goes more into the spiritual politics of, is this truly something that the people as their own individual sense want to have, a degrowth, simple living that removes those external wants that have become quite consumable and quite admired by at least middle-class Indians and many Indians. So now moving on to the 22nd chapter, this goes into the healthcare of India. And what's interesting about the healthcare model in India is that whereas in countries like the UK, where the healthcare system, the national healthcare system, was a result of the effort of the masses and their demand for social supports that eventually became provided by the state, the Indian public was given a massive healthcare system through a unilateral elitist structure without much of a struggle from the masses. This can almost be seen as an example of how generous the Indian state is to the people, but the lack of local consensus and how healthcare should have been distributed to its people poses a unique problem. There are two facets in using the term progressivism in the Western sense, and having essentially lived in the West my whole life and now living in Argentina, which is essentially in the periphery of the West, I'm going to use a term to describe the Indian public healthcare context with this Western bias. I did try to exclude it, but this is my Western bias that I do believe has some valuable insight for the Indian context though. So the first is that progressivism can mean being a goal for the people of a nation, i.e. enacting nationwide healthcare. The second is that progressivism can mean being fought for by the people and thus seen as a democratic process. The Indian healthcare model is seen as essentially a progressive move in some aspects, that it aims to support its people through a benevolent state, i.e. the first form of progressivism I was referring to. But what is interesting is that it is also not progressive in the other second form I was discussing, in that the top-down structure that excluded the people in the process shows it as not progressive, not from the people exactly. This example is a fascinating case to study when we evaluate what it means for a state to be benevolent and how it can still be undemocratic at the same time. The Indian case provides a word of caution in implementing or reforming any nationwide healthcare or any nationwide systems for its people's benefits, no matter how benevolent they are. One element that is crucial when discussing any national healthcare system is the nation, or to be more specific, the people who define the nation. The people themselves are, in the end, the ones to whom a national healthcare system is supposed to benefit. And though the goal might be to provide a higher quality of life for Indians, which is a great goal, there wasn't a popular push that really preceded this movement. At least in the Indian context, there wasn't this big movement for this healthcare system that was enacted quite quickly after independence. And perhaps if there was more of a push for the nationwide healthcare system from the masses, not only would this have likely been a more democratic and inclusive process for the Indian people, but the system would probably have been revered more positively as a product of the masses' democratic efforts. Since it was essentially handed to them in some way, even though it wasn't the type of handout that they wanted in that form, there wasn't a moment of democratic unity to really unite this massive system, the people with this massive system. Now, this is not to say that the Indian state should have waited longer and not given them this system until the people began begging for one, but the optics of this situation of the state quite soon giving the system early on to its people might have something to do with the lack of Indians' participatory value in this institution. Again, the word progressive I use in a Western context, which I am not familiar, which I am familiar with, but the aim of supporting the people in a country like India through a strong healthcare system follows some of the framework for what we refer to as progressivism. And that's why I try to connect it as a progressive issue where it's both progressive in its end result, but it is not progressive through its means. Then that becomes a question, is one more progressive than the other? Or at the very least, to make it a little less Western sounding, is one more for the people and better for the people's benefit than the other? I'm also fascinated by this issue where the state seems incapable of aiding its people in healthcare. Especially from the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, the private sector has shown itself as a more capable body in some sense. The private sector is a streamlined, efficient system, at least compared to the state system, for providing healthcare to Indian citizens in a country that has seen increasing wealth come in and a growing middle class able to attain these alternatives outside of the state's capacity. What this is showing is that there is a healthy dynamic between the state and the private sector that could potentially come up for something like healthcare, especially for the urban Indians who have better access to this. So reading this, I just wonder, how effective would a reorganized public healthcare system might be if more state support could be redirected to the rural areas where the private sector is currently not as prevalent as it is compared to the urban. And perhaps this could be in the form of something like higher wages for rural workers, since there are few workers to support the rural Indian healthcare and rural Indian people. More of an administrative idea that I was just discussing, and this from including more poor, well, this is more of an administrative idea that I don't really have the specifics for, and I am definitely aware of the loopholes and issues that can arise from this, including poorer urban Indians being at the risk of losing efficient healthcare and the monopolizing of urban healthcare. But the private sector's potential shouldn't be neglected, especially following the pandemic. And this isn't to say down with the state and that let the free market work, because the private sector can definitely not match the Indian state's spending and resources for healthcare to a country of over 1 billion people. But I believe, given India's massive healthcare model, that it is still able to deliver results, albeit not to an efficient extent as does the private sector does to its small portion of the Indian population. But the nation as a whole and the states themselves are dealing with the private sector and trying to work to incorporate them together and fueling the growth of the country. And this is a model that I think the world should keep an eye out for, because it's an incredible political laboratory into how the world's most populous country has a great capacity to bring up a country of 1.4 billion people to become a rapidly upcoming key player in the world, thanks to the efforts of healthcare, which can make Indian people live longer, have longer lives, and provide more for the Indian state. So that is the end of this book, actually. So I didn't do the beginning because I started midway, and I just started working on this now as a way of getting myself more familiar with talking about my analytical interpretations of the text that I've been reading. But it's such a fascinating case, I would say, that India is this country that, even though we in the US at least discuss more China's growing rapid rate and how it's possibly our next contender in the world stage, India, although it's probably not going to outpace us like in a random notice that no one will see coming, but India does seem to be coming at such a fascinatingly quick rate that I think it's a case that we should be keeping an eye out for, because not only is this, some people can take it as the sense of an alarm, as we kind of do with China in the West, but it's also, we should see it as a sense of fascination, because this is an interesting case where this huge country, newly independent, under the former rules of British power, now its own power on its own right, similar to how the United States was in some ways after being under British control, this state is also showing an amazing potential to become an important player in the world's politics. Now, some things I noticed were a bit hard for me to grasp, because being from the West, for example, the whole progressive argument that I try to make it more of a not so Western bias concept, but I try to apply it to just the general concept of India's situation at least. This whole concept of trying to understand the Indian context, South Asian politics, it's a bit difficult. You have to admit when it's something that you're not too familiar with. Honestly, I can see myself living in South Asia for some time in my life, maybe to study and work there also. That'd be an amazing opportunity because South Asian politics is such an interesting case that we don't really discuss much or think too much about in the US at least. So I believe that India is such an important key player that we should continue watching out for. And I don't mean that necessarily the negative sense, I just mean looking out for, seeing what they're doing because they're coming up quickly, and it's a case that might show how, at least in the South Asian context, this power can come up as an important player in the whole region and essentially could become an important player in just the whole global politics that we deal with.